What if I told you that the Vikings, those masters of the North Atlantic, were never truly threatened by enemy swords, but by something far more ordinary and far more deadly? What if the greatest danger on a Viking longship was the very water that surrounded it? For centuries we pictured Viking voyages as triumphs of engineering and courage. But hidden beneath that legend is a quieter truth, one so strange, so counterintuitive, that it forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about life at sea. Because the Vikings sailed across the coldest, harshest waters on Earth, without access to the one thing every human absolutely requires to survive. And what they did to overcome that problem? Well, let's just say, it changed the fate of the North. When we picture Viking voyages, we tend to see the iconic image: first hardened warriors gripping oars, wind ripping through their cloaks, longships slicing across iron-gray seas. But we almost never picture the danger that haunted them quietly, day after day. Not storms, not rival clans, not even hunger. It was thirst, the slow, creeping enemy that could kill a crew long before any battle ever began. A typical Viking longship carried 40 to 80 men, yet only enough fresh water for a handful of days. Every drop had to be rationed like treasure. Unlike the warm Mediterranean, the North Sea and North Atlantic were merciless. Endless water in every direction, yet not a single mouthful safe to drink. Salt, cold, and wind created a landscape beautiful from afar, deadly up close. Later Norse sagas hint at the desperation of these voyages. Some men sucked moisture from wool fleece. Others chewed frost scraped from their shields at sunrise. These weren't dramatic flourishes, they were survival tactics. Modern physiology proves what the Vikings learned through suffering. Drink seawater, and the kidneys are overwhelmed almost instantly. The body loses more water than it gains. Muscles cramp, vision blurs, minds fracture. Within days, dehydration becomes fatal. And that leads to the mystery that still puzzles historians today. How did the Vikings cross thousands of unforgiving miles to Iceland, Greenland, even North America, when so many other cultures avoided the open ocean entirely because they couldn't secure drinkable water? The answer opens a hidden doorway into one of the most remarkable, overlooked feats of survival engineering in human history. Before the Vikings could ever dream of dominating the open sea, they first had to understand its rhythms and the sky above it. The North taught them a brutal truth early on. Rain wasn't a blessing, it was survival. But unlike sailors of warmer latitudes, who could count on predictable tropical storms, the Vikings lived under a sky that followed no rules. Northern weather could shift from clear blue to slate gray in minutes, then refuse to rain for weeks. Yet, out of this chaos, the Vikings engineered one of Europe's earliest shipboard rain harvesting systems. During gentle showers, crews stretched their woolen sails tight, letting droplets gather and run toward the center. When storms roared across the deck, they raised linen cloths like great white nets to catch the downpour. Wooden gutters carved along the shield rails guided precious water into barrels waiting below. Archaeologists studying the Oseberg and Gokstad ships found thorns of evidence. Not just the barrels themselves, but chemical traces suggesting they once held pure water, not ale or mead. Those Vikings were preparing for survival, not celebration. But technique alone wasn't enough. Discipline mattered. Before a storm, crews scrubbed their canvas clean, a decision that cost them valuable water. They didn't understand microbes, but they understood that dirt made water dangerous. Their world demanded intuition long before science offered explanations. And yet, even with all that effort, the Vikings knew the sky was fickle. The North Atlantic could withhold rain for agonizing stretches of time, days rolling into weeks with nothing but cold wind and empty clouds. So they adapted again. When the heavens refused to help them, the Vikings searched for water in places no one else would even think to look. The Vikings were children of the Arctic frontier, shaped by a world where cold ruled everything and survival demanded imagination. They understood the land and sea with an intimacy few cultures have ever matched. And that knowledge taught them to look for water not where it was obvious, but where it quietly hid. One of the strangest lessons came at dawn. dew, that thin, crystal-like moisture settling on cloth and wood, became a lifeline. In rural Norway, shepherds still collect dew today using wool and linen, echoing techniques born in the Viking Age. At sea, crews soaked their woolen cloaks overnight, letting the humid air of the North Atlantic cling to every fiber. When morning broke, men wrung out those cloaks into wooden bowls, gathering only a cup or two. But sometimes, a cup was everything. Absurd? Perhaps to modern eyes. But in the North, survival didn't come in gallons. It came in inches, in droplets, in the patience to accept whatever nature was willing to give. And then came the most reliable ally of the far north: sea ice. Unlike seawater, sea ice traps far less salt. Viking sailors knew this instinctively. When drifting floes came near, they chipped away at them with axes or knives, hauling chunks aboard. Some melted the ice over low flames. Others laid it out under the sun to soften. And Afar. The sagas describe white water from God's own hand, a poetic nod to snowmelt and glacial ice gifts from the frozen world that carried them. These methods didn't replenish their stores completely. They bought time. A day. Maybe two. But for voyages stretching toward Iceland, Greenland, or the western lands beyond, time alone wasn't enough. The Vikings needed something more powerful, a breakthrough that went beyond improvisation and into true innovation. Long before Caribbean pirates perfected the art of charring barrels, the Vikings had already stumbled onto a similar secret, not through theory or chemistry, but through centuries of lived observation. In Norse daily life, barrels were everywhere. They stored ale, fish oil, smoked meats, dairy, even tar. And over time, the Vikings noticed something curious. Some barrels kept liquids fresh longer than others. Some never developed that sour, swampy smell. Some resisted mold. Some preserved flavor instead of ruining it. The common denominator wasn't craftsmanship or luck. It was fire. When a barrel's interior had been exposed to heat, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because it previously held hot tar, the wood darkened, pores tightened, the surface hardened. Without knowing the term sterilization, the Vikings understood its power. Modern cooperage confirms it. Charring closes microscopic channels in the wood, kills bacteria, and creates a thin layer of natural carbon that acts like a primitive water filter. On longships, archaeologists have found barrels with interiors darkened to a deep smoky black, unmistakable signs of heat treatment. That wasn't aesthetics. That wasn't an accident. That was survival engineering. Fire made water last longer. It made stale water taste cleaner. It slowed the invisible decay that could doom an entire crew. For a people who crossed some of the harshest waters on Earth, this wasn't convenience, it was strategy. Centuries ahead of its time, the Vikings were unknowingly practicing principles that modern distillers and survivalists still rely on today. But the real surprise lies in what they added next. A trick so unexpected and so effective that it would push their water preservation methods far beyond anything the sagas ever bothered to record. To the Vikings, silver was more than wealth. It was identity. Rings, coins, twisted armbands. These pieces traveled with them from homeland to battlefield to burial mound. Silver paid debts, sealed alliances, and signaled status. But on the open sea, far from markets and mead halls, silver held a different kind of power. One the Vikings may not have fully understood but absolutely relied on. Silver, unlike most metals, is a natural enemy of bacteria. When submerged in water, it releases microscopic ions that disrupt the life cycle of microbes, slowing or stopping their growth altogether. Ancient cultures like the Persians and Greeks knew this intuitively. They stored water in silver vessels to keep it sweet and safe. And while no Viking saga spells it out, the clues left behind whisper the truth. Archaeologists examining Viking-age drinking vessels often find elevated traces of silver, even when those vessels likely held water, whey, or other non-alcoholic liquids. In some ship burials, small silver fragments appear inside storage barrels, suggesting intentional placement. Charred wood filtered impurities. Silver prevented decay. Together, the combination created a water system far more advanced than the era should have allowed. This subtle technique likely extended the life of their drinking water from a matter of days to weeks, crucial on journeys stretching across the North Atlantic. It wasn't magic. It was observation, tradition, and a kind of inherited practical wisdom passed quietly through generations of sailors. But even silver couldn't stop time. Eventually, every barrel spoiled. Every drop turned musty or dangerous. And when that moment came, the Vikings reached for their boldest, most hazardous method, a technique that flirted with fire and risked the very ships they sailed, yet offered the only promise of truly fresh water in a world made of salt. Distillation wasn't a Viking invention. It had existed for centuries in parts of Asia and the Middle East, where alchemists and early scientists learned to separate liquids by heat. But what makes the Viking story extraordinary is how they adapted the idea, reshaping it into a rough, sea-going technology that could function on a cramped, rocking longship in the middle of the North Atlantic. They took what they had and made it work. A simple iron or bronze cooking pot became the heart of the system. Into it went seawater, bubbling and hissing over a carefully controlled flame. Above it, wool or stretched animal hide was secured, turning into a primitive condensing surface where vapor cooled and gathered into trembling droplets. Curved bits of metal, wooden troughs, or even carved bone channels guided each drop into waiting containers. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't stable. And every sailor knew the danger. An open flame on a wooden ship was a gamble with fate. But the reward was priceless. Even a cup or two of fresh water per hour could rescue a crew drifting toward dehydration. Historians now believe that vague saga references to boiling the sea may not have been metaphor at all, but hints at a forgotten Norse innovation. A survival trick passed quietly between captains. These improvised stills didn't produce much. They didn't need to. The Vikings weren't chasing purity or scientific efficiency. They weren't building laboratories. They were trying to stay alive, one cooled droplet at a time. In a world ruled by salt water, fire became their last hope, a fragile partnership between heat and steam that allowed a wooden ship full of thirsty men to keep moving toward the horizon. Here lies one of the most surprising truths in the entire Viking survival story. They didn't depend on pure water at all. In fact, water was the least trusted liquid aboard a longship. Instead, the Vikings relied on a quiet, brilliant ally: fermentation. Weak ale, sour whey, diluted mead. These weren't luxury drinks. They were lifelines. Fermentation transformed fragile liquids into something steady, predictable, and safe. Low-alcohol ale, usually just 2–3%, was resistant to bacterial growth in a way plain water never could be. It didn't spoil quickly. It didn't turn foul within days. And it delivered calories at a time when every bit of energy mattered. Then there was Meisinger, a tart, acidic whey drink left over from cheese-making. To the Vikings, it was more than a byproduct. It was electrolyte-rich, refreshing, long-lasting, and shockingly resilient against contamination. A crew could store it for weeks without fear. To us, this might look primitive. But the science is undeniable. Fermented drinks were safer than water, easier to preserve, naturally protected against microbes, hydrating and mildly nutritious, and dependable in a world where nothing else was. This is why sagas mention ale rations far more often than water rations. Not because Vikings staggered across the deck drunk, that's Hollywood's fantasy, but because ale was the most reliable liquid they had. It kept them alive. But even this fermented shield had limits. When storms dragged on, when ale ran low, when whey soured or mead thinned to nothing, the Vikings faced the same ancient threat all over again. Thirst returned, and they still needed a way to push farther into the unknown. When conditions turned brutal, and every stored liquid had been stretched to its limit, Viking crews entered a realm of survival that few modern people can imagine. The sagas, usually poetic and sparse, suddenly become raw in these moments. They describe men forced to push the boundaries of human endurance and creativity. Some boiled seaweed, not for food, but to extract whatever faint moisture its fibers could surrender. Others mixed fresh snow with animal fat, trying to prevent the shock that comes from consuming ice-cold water on an empty, dehydrated stomach. Many chewed birch bark not for nourishment, but to trigger saliva, to trick the body into feeling less desperate, less dry, less close to failure. These weren't myths. These were field-tested techniques. Remarkably, some Icelandic fishing crews were still using similar methods as late as the 1800s. Living echoes of Viking maritime culture, preserved across a millennium of harsh northern life. But even with every trick, every ounce of discipline, every scrap of ingenuity, sometimes it simply wasn't enough. The sagas tell of voyages where the sea did not forgive, where storms dragged on, where rain never came, where barrels ran dry and ice was nowhere to be found. And in those stories, the ending is stark. Sometimes the sea won. That reality made water not just a resource, but something close to sacred, a substance earned, not taken. Each drop represented skill, tradition, and knowledge handed down through generations of sailors who knew exactly what was at stake. And this is where the true genius of the Vikings emerges, not in their weapons, not in their raids, but in the quiet, relentless intelligence that allowed them to defy an ocean designed to consume the unprepared. Of all the forces that shaped Viking society, honor, kinship, warfare, exploration, none influenced their behavior more quietly, yet more powerfully, than water. On land, it sustained communities. At sea, it dictated survival. And aboard a longship, water wasn't just a resource, it was a code of conduct, a system of values, a moral compass that bound the crew together. Water shaped discipline, because rationing demanded absolute obedience. It shaped leadership, because a captain's wisdom was measured not only in battle, but in how long he could keep his men alive. It shaped morale, because a crew with full barrels rode with confidence, while a thirsty one fell into fear and despair. It even shaped mutiny, as some of the rarest rebellions in Norse history began not over treasure or honor, but over water rations. And it shaped ritual, as sharing water became an act of trust deeper than giving silver or swearing an oath. Hoarding water, in some cases, meant death. Sharing it meant brotherhood. The sagas treat water with symbolic weight. It appears as a gift from generous hosts, a weapon when withheld, or a miracle when emerging from unexpected corners of the natural world. To control water, to find it, preserve it, and distribute it wisely, was to control fate itself. This philosophy is why the Vikings could do what so few cultures dared: settle Iceland, survive the perilous crossing to Greenland, and push onward to Vinland. Their empire wasn't carved by axes alone. It was carved by hydration, by the knowledge of how to endure an environment designed to break lesser sailors. Their mastery of the ocean came not from brute strength, but from understanding the rules of the world they moved through. And water was rule number one. And now, we finally return to the question that opened this entire journey. How did the Vikings survive oceans that should have killed them within days? They survived because they learned not through theory, but through hardship. Through soaked sails, frozen hands, and countless voyages where one mistake meant the end. They learned that water could be both the greatest enemy and the greatest ally. They learned that the sea punishes arrogance, but rewards ingenuity. And they learned that survival wasn't about strength, or fury, or even courage. It was about adaptation. The Vikings endured because they adapted faster than the ocean could break them. They treated every drop of water like wealth, guarded it more fiercely than silver, and shared it more meaningfully than gold. They built tools, created rituals, and shaped entire codes of behavior around the simple act of staying hydrated. While other civilizations saw the open ocean as a barrier, a realm of monsters, storms, and impossible distances, the Vikings saw possibility in the mist. Where others saw danger, they saw pathways. Where others hesitated, they prepared. And that preparation, not recklessness, is what carried them across the world's most unforgiving waters. They didn't sail because they were fearless. They sailed because they were ready. In the end, the longships that reached Iceland, Greenland, and the distant shores of Vinland didn't arrive through brute force alone. They arrived because their crews understood the elemental truth hidden in every wave. To master the sea, you must first master water itself. If this journey through Viking survival taught you something new about their world, something deeper than battles, deeper than legends, consider joining us for more explorations into the forgotten chapters of human history. Here on Prehistoric Shadows, we uncover the hidden mechanisms that shaped our ancestors' survival and the echoes they left in us today. 17s2. There was a part of Leaswell, the opposite of coming. They were dated doy, animated, and like Tapian Suver, the Vikings crossed the impossible because they understood a truth we often forget. Civilizations rise not through strength, but through knowledge of how to stay alive when the world turns hostile. Thank you for watching. Stay curious. And remember, the shadows of the past still shape the world beneath our feet.